Hello. This is not necessarily a presentation, just a verbal response toward the claim, many claims by many Christians, not all Christians, that the biblical worldview, in their mind, contains the absolute morality, and that this is a foundation. This absolute morality is the foundation of should be the foundation of ethics. Uh, there's some problems with this. First, as you can see in my response, myth of biblical absolute morality. Um, the reason I make this assertion is not because I'm trying to. We just simply can't believe there's absolute morality in the Bible, or atheists or non-Christians. It's not that reason. It's not the reason that we're afraid. We're afraid that we will be held accountable, or we don't want to be held accountable. It's because we read the Bible and we clearly reason that there's no such thing as absolute morality. I want to say that because many of our Christian apologists tend to make this accusation. I just don't. I really don't want to sit there and sound arrogant or try to demean those who believe this and say that they are stupid. I don't think they're stupid. I just think that they have an erroneous view. Now, let me explain why. It can be clearly shown that many moral axioms uh, or many moral commandments, even the ones that even the ones that evangelicals will claim that are moral commandments, are relative. First, in any moral commandment, you have two components. The first component is the the prohibition of an act, saying, asserting that one should not commit a certain act, for example, adultery, or the moral duty, which means the divine command to perform a certain act or to feel a certain way, because morality is not just human actions, it's also an attitude within a Christian biblical perspective. Okay, that's one component. So again, the first component of the moral commandment is either specifying a prohibition of a certain act, i.e., adultery, or a moral requirement, a moral demand, or a demand to commit a certain act, which could be worship the Sabbath day or believe in God. And when I'm talking about actions, I'm not just talking about actions, physical, external actions. I'm also talking about cognitive actions. Okay, so that's the first component of a moral commandment. The second part of a moral commandment, especially in the Old Testament, is the moral response toward failing to obey what is instructed in the first component. So this second component is, how do you respond toward people who are homosexual? How do you respond toward people who do commit adultery and commit adultery? How do you respond to people who do lie? Uh, that is equally the moral part of the commandment. So a commandment has those two components. As we can see in the issue of adultery, or in the category of adultery in the Old Testament, adultery is prohibited. Yes, adultery is prohibited. However, in the Old Testament, adultery is prohibited, but the moral response toward adultery is to stone the person to death. That is the law of Moses. So in stoning this person to death, or if you have to stone this person to death, or if, you know whoever Moses assigns, or whoever God assigns, I don't know who assigns what, to stone an adulterer or adulteress to death. In that action, those who watched it have to be, their attitude must be in support of it. They should not, they shouldn't feel uncomfortable with it. They should not feel that, oh, I wouldn't do it. If he signed me, I wouldn't do it. But it's God. But that's what God and Moses wanted to do. No, no, no. You support God's laws. You don't disagree with God's laws if you are truly a supporter of biblical morality. So the supporters who watch this person get stoned to death and bleed to death because they had sex with somebody outside their marriage, um, those people, if they are following the will of God according to the Old Testament, they must support it. They must be in agreement with it. They should be comfortable with it. Okay. Now, the main point is that the moral response in the New Testament towards adultery is drastically different than the moral response in the Old Testament. If you go to John 8:5 to 8:10, Christ asserts that one should forgive somebody who commits adultery because perhaps everyone has committed adultery in their brain because they lust for another person outside their marriage, or they have divorced. And since you have committed that type of sin, you should forgive that person. That is drastically different than the judgment which is inflicted by death by Yahweh in the Old Testament. And I don't think you can really make the counter argument that, well, the absolute morality of, morality only deals with, the moral commandments of God did not change in terms of, what he wants us to do and what he wants us not to do. The punishment may have changed, but, you know, that part of the law has not changed. Well, I'm sorry, that's not a moral absolute. You are in biblical morality, you are divinely instructed to respond towards sin in a specific way. Okay, it is very plausible for us to say that there is a drastic change from the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, I'm sure many Christian apologists could say, well, Christ knew that he was going to die for our sins, and when he died for our sins, the penalty of death is erased in all the sins that were in the Old Testament considered fatal. Still does not change the fact that you morally respond differently towards sin in the Old Testament when it comes to adultery than in the New Testament when it comes to adultery. It's still a relativistic axiom. Its change is bound to time. In order for you to have an absolute moral axiom, is to, if the only biblical view that could possibly defend this is possibly an Orthodox Jew. Not I'm talking about the mainstream Jew, not mainstream Judaism. I'm talking about a very Orthodox Jew who believes that right now they can stone a woman to death for adultery or stone a man to death for adultery. Orthodox Muslims, which are in a greater proportion, they can claim that their Quranic worldview is absolute because they believe some, not most. I don't. Hopefully not most. I don't think most. No, actually not most. Some Muslims, even the most conservative, even among the most conservative Muslims, the minority of conservative Muslims, the minority believe that stoning to death a woman for adultery is plausible now, and obviously it was plausible back then. That is close to an absolute moral axiom. Morality is not simply just prohibiting action and from a biblical standpoint. It's also how the society deals with people who break moral laws, which they believe is 100% grounded in the Bible. So, you know, just using adultery, we can use many other biblical laws. It's not simply just adultery. There's many other biblical moral laws that, yes, Christians will say the prohibition of homosexuality is consistent, which he may be consistent in the New Testament if you interpret Paul's his diatribe to be prohibiting homosexuality. Yes, if we grant you that that is consistent, is the moral response consistent? And that's not, we don't think that's a very superficial issue. That is a major issue in a biblical interpretation of morality. No, the biblical response toward homosexuality in the Old Testament is death. The alleged biblical moral response toward homosexuality in modern Christianity or Christianity right now is rebuking, is to demean the act, but love the sinner. That is different. It's clearly different. There's no way around it. So this is why um skeptics or non-Christians have issues with these type of claims. And I hope those who subscribe or who claim that they have a biblical worldview of morality that's absolute, I hope this will help them, will make them think about it.